just take it. And we've got Evan Tarracciano from Football Diehards is going to start the night talking about a little in-season management tonight. Then we're going to go to Dr. Roto from Scout Fantasy, Hussein the Brain from the Fantasy Couch. We'll have Brandon Marianne Lee from Fantasy Alarm. Emil Cadlick talking his stomp theory. And by the way, thanks to Emil for putting this all together once again. Can't say that enough. And Gary Davenport. I know you've all been waiting for IDP happiness, and Gary Davenport will bring it in big time. So I don't want to hold up and cut into too much of Evan's time. This is Evan Tarracciano from Football Diehards. Evan, you're here to talk in-season management and all that kind of fun stuff. So, sir, the floor is yours. I'll be standing by as needed.
Sure thing. Well, first and foremost, welcome to everybody. Thank you very much for joining in. It's a pleasure to be aboard, and once again, thank you to Emil for setting this whole thing up, and to Bob for helping me out here. So if you guys have any questions during the broadcast, Bob's going to be my cohort in crime over here. Feel free to ask them away, and I'm sure Bob can let me know as they appear. Otherwise, I mean, we had a lot of stuff to talk about. First off, quick introduction about myself. If you don't know who the heck I am, I'm one of the senior writers over at footballdiehards.com. I do a little bit of editing work over there as well. Been with the staff since the beginning of the 2016 season. I do the Crystal Ball article, do a Facebook chat and all that fun stuff. So if you haven't checked me out in the past, feel free to hit me up. And on to in-season management, which I guess is my forte. I'll be dead honest. Look, I'm not a daily player. I primarily play in season-long leagues, so a lot of times when I get these questions on Twitter and on my Facebook feed saying, oh, the price of this guy this week on XYZ site is blankety blank blank, I just, look, to me it's all Greek. I don't have the time for that, but season-long content is where I'm at, and especially when it comes to in-season management. What the heck is in-season management anyway? Well, it's pretty much anything outside the draft. It's going to be 90-something% of your entire season. And, of course, in my opinion, it's the most important. All the football diehards, we always preach about how important it is to go into the draft as prepared as possible. Go ahead and make your pre-built rankings. Go ahead and have a strategy going in, but be adaptable. We talk about all this, and look, that's all the draft stuff. Once you exit the draft, hopefully you have a pretty good idea of where you fall compared to the remainder of your league. Those of us that play in the mom and pop style leagues, the friends and family formats, which I'm sure that the majority of us do, it's great. Some of us might play in a little bit more competitive formats, a little more cookies on the line, as it were. Those are obviously going to be a little bit more cutthroat. But look, in-season management is going to come down to a handful of points. Lineup construction. Waiver wire is obviously a big thing that we talk about week in, week out. Majority of articles on the site that you're going to see have to deal with waiver wire pickups, who to get, why these guys are becoming relevant, etc. Making trades, identifying some future targets, some guys maybe just to kind of put on your watch list, on your flag list. How to deal with bye weeks. And the last thing I wanted to just quickly talk about was how to stream kickers and defenses. So a lot of stuff to talk about. A lot of it's just going to be kind of high-level overview. I'll try and give my tips and tricks when I can. I've been doing fantasy sports for, I don't even know, nearly 20 years at this point, so I might be dating myself in my gray hair. I'm getting like Bob, but I haven't lost it all quite yet. But just starting off with lineup construction. So like I said, you should have a pretty good idea of where you stand. Where's your team strong? Where's your team weak? The second that the fantasy football season starts, I get bombarded with trade questions, and sometimes before the league even starts. I'm sure Bob's the same way. I'm getting trade questions before week one. You don't need to necessarily make a trade right this second, but I know that a lot of us are under this mindset of, well, fantasy baseball is this really, really long season, and, the marathon, not a sprint adage that they keep on throwing out there. Just take a look and take a deep breath first, though. Take a look at your lineup. You might be weak at wide receiver. You might be weak at running back. You might be strong at quarterback. Who knows how exactly you drafted your team? A lot of us as a whole, especially this season, know which positions are a little bit deeper than others. We know that wide receiver's deep. We know that quarterback's deep. We know that we can wait on those positions. We know that a lot of people are going to be drafting running backs, especially in PPR formats, pretty early. We know that tight ends are a bit of a crapshoot when it comes to outside of the top handful of guys. Kickers and defenses, I'll talk about that later, but for the most part, I don't sweat it. I pretty sure I speak for the vast majority of experts here that if you are in some wacky points league that rewards crazy points for interceptions and return touchdowns and all that, then that's one thing. But I just pretty safely ignore it. But take a look at your roster when you get out of the draft. Where exactly do you think that you can improve? And is this a league that you've been in for a decade or two? Or is this a league you might have just joined? I know, as an example, in my home league, I have players that I play with. I love them to death, but the second that the draft is over, they have to take a look at their team. They get all freaked out about the draft report card from whatever website they play on, and say, oh, well, blankety blank site said I got a D in my draft this year. That must mean I just have a terrible team. Well, don't overreact. Take a breath. Let it sink in for a minute. You don't have to make trades right away, but it never hurts to start preparing from the get-go. Knowing kind of where you stand, knowing where, again, those strengths and weaknesses lie, that's kind of a key thing, especially as it gets to be trading. Waiver wire pickups and trades are obviously going to be the big two ways that you can either add to your team throughout the course of the season. You can augment your team, but for the most part, your team should really be in place. I always tell people that the trades and the waiver wire, they're really meant to supplement your team. They're not meant to be a complete and total restart button overhaul. It's great to pick up some guys throughout the course of the season that might be able to help you. Certainly there are going to be waiver wire pickups that will provide dividends for you. Good return on investment, especially earlier on in the year. It's where a lot of your big point getters might come from. But don't go crazy. Don't go crazy about it. The biggest thing to do in season, and this is going to be for everything, it's really 2 words: be active, be informed. No matter where you get the information from, whether it's TV, SiriusXM, Twitter feed from any of our experts here, Facebook, wherever, even if you have just a smartphone and an app, get the information constantly. The quicker you're able to obtain it, the quicker you're able to adapt to it, the better off you're going to be, obviously, in the long run. Any league that you aren't active in, you're basically just blowing off money. If you have to take a hiatus or whatever, that's fine, I suppose, but be active, especially when it comes to trades, especially when it comes to each and every week taking a look at the way that you stand as opposed to the remainder of the teams in your league. It's too short of a season just to not be able to focus on things like that. I usually just spend, 5-10 minutes at the end of each evening just taking a look at the latest news and notes, flipping throughout the course of the day. Obviously, what Bob and I do really makes us immersed in everything. But now that the games occur on Thursdays, sometimes Saturdays, Sundays, Mondays, football happens so much now, and there's really no off season anymore between free agency and the draft and the combine and everything else. The football doesn't stop. That's why we call ourselves the diehards, because we cover things all year round. Some of you might not be like that. Some of you might just be like, the second the Super Bowl is over and done with, maybe you just switch to fantasy baseball mode or whatever. Maybe just don't care about sports until football comes around again. Who knows? Bob's like, what the heck's baseball? But there are other sports. Maybe hockey or basketball might be your thing. But look, I just would recommend strongly just stay informed. It's a really simple concept. It sounds really stupid. You're like, well, this is no duh tip, but spend time with it every single day, every single night, even if it's only for 5 or 10 minutes. And again, just stay on top of things. Don't overreact. That's a big tip. Knee-jerk reactions, I find, hurt more than help. Way more often. You might have drafted a sleeper pick that all of us were touting in the beginning, and he's appearing in magazines and radio content, and we keep on saying that his physical prowess is going to get him into the lineup, and maybe the coaching staff doesn't see it that way week 1 or week 2. But eventually a lot of these waiver wire guys, you might just kind of, again, flag them a little bit, keep an eye on them. Don't cut your guys too early. I think is another thing that I get a lot of questions on. Dropping a top 5 player at a given position, a top 5 round selection in exchange for this week's flavor of the week. Projections, I think, on sites are obviously a bit skewed sometimes, depending upon your format, whether it's PPR, non-PPR, depending upon what website you play on. Projections, I feel like everybody's a slave to them. You want to have your lineup set to the maximum projections possible, and then hey, my win rate now is 52 to 48 instead of 50-50, and I might take it home instead. Just go with your gut. I think is a big thing. Trust yourself and don't overreact. Again, basic fundamental things, and they sound really stupid, but the more you just come to trust yourself and your particular analysis, the better off you're going to be. Plenty of times I've had a wide receiver that has 1 or 2 catches and no touchdowns a couple weeks in a row. And doesn't it always seem like that following week when we say, well, the heck with this guy, I'm done with him, then he has that six catch, 2 touchdown, type week. Just stay consistent. A lot of the rosters that I have come to draft over the years aren't really boom or bust. They're a little bit more predictable, I guess you could say, in terms of their projected outputs every single week. I don't typically go for those Devery Henderson-esque type people where they might have 3 catches for 3 touchdowns in a given week. I try to get guys that just are solid production, maybe boring, might rely on veterans a little bit more than most, but I just like to have somewhat of predictability for my roster. Another note I have here, look, a lot of these waiver wire players that tend to break out and give you the most amount of return on investment, you get those early in the season. I know I alluded to that before, especially with running backs due to the nature of the position, due to how frequently these guys get hurt, to a lesser degree wide receivers. But take a look at some of the players that essentially were unowned coming out of the drafts last season. Evan Ingram, Deshaun Watson, Greg Zuerlein, Robbie Anderson, Jaguars defense, Carson Wentz, Alvin Kamara. I mean, a lot of these guys, the earlier that you were able to obtain them, even if it wasn't their big breakout week, the better off you are. So again, just being active, going back there, flagging a couple guys that you might actually like. I know that we talk all the time. Okay, so you've left the draft. Now it's week 1. Now it's week 3. Now it's week 5. You know what? I still have an entire stack of players that no one else has drafted. It might be the backup running back, and that's fine. Just again, know your teams, know depth. The better prepared you're going to be, the better off you are. So that way, look, if an injury occurs, you don't have to worry about, who's going to pick it up this week? Is it this a guy that has soft hands and is a third down back? Is it a bruiser? This particular player was hurt, so who's going to be his immediate replacement? Having all that set aside, having just maybe a quick list, 5, 10, 15 guys that you think are prime breakout candidates this year in advance, way super duper sleepers, pencil them in. Just go ahead and keep an eye on them. News and notes, especially throughout the course of training camps, throughout the course of the preseason. I think that I like to view it like as a Hard Knocks viewpoint. Each and every year, the more exposure that certain teams get during the preseason, whether it comes to Hard Knocks as an example, or just how nationally televised all these preseason games are now, the more of an overreaction you are. I remember that in one season, and Bob might be able to remind me of which particular year it was, Chris Johnson had this amazing preseason game. He had some 80-something yard rushing touchdown in the second or third preseason, and everybody was like, oh, well, Chris Johnson, a couple years after this whole CJ2K thing, but maybe still has plenty left in the tank. And I succumbed to it. I fell to it. I ended up drafting him just based upon really one play. And I was like, well, if he could do this in this preseason, maybe he can hold up. Maybe he can actually surprise the coaching staff. Again, limit the knee-jerk reactions. Take the careers as a whole. Every single year we kind of crap on players that are old, that might not have the whole stigma of being the sexy pick this year. I mean, Bob, how many years in a row have we said, is this the year of the demise of Larry Fitzgerald?
Right. That, and look, I mean, preseason, if we're looking at preseason, Evan, I mean, I go back to the ultimate preseason superstar, Travis Jervey, who averaged 10 yards a carry over the course of his career in the preseason, only to disappear when game plans come into play and pure speed is no longer enough to fuel the fire.
Mm-hmm. So, look, certain players are going to have the ability to transition. I mean, we know that a Hall of Fame caliber talent, and he might be the outlier here. But don't necessarily always succumb to the sexy picks. Don't come out of the draft and take a look at your team and it's all upside and no guarantee. You don't necessarily want to do that. Again, mixing and matching is a big thing that I like to do. Have some upside, certainly. You don't want to have a team that's capped in terms of its ceiling, but keep an eye on these steady, boring type players that may or may not walk into some production. Big thing that I always get questions about, and it's a big sticking point for some of my articles here is FAB or waiver wires and how exactly should you treat them. When it gets to be during the middle of the season, how much should you bid on FAB? Well, kind of the bad answer is that unfortunately everybody's league is a little bit different. Some people work on $1,000 pool, some people work on $100 pool. Some people have extremely aggressive owners that they're in their league. Some people just don't pay attention at all. I think obviously because every league is different, it's hard for me to say that player ABC is now going to have a role because the guy in front of him got hurt. So if you spend $5 this week, you're guaranteed to get him. It doesn't work that way, folks. That's why in my articles, I generally speaking try to give a percentage as opposed to a flat amount. I would strongly encourage, if there are any commissioners that are out there that have not already switched to a FAB-based system, to do so. I don't really like the waiver wire system much. I get why it's in place, certainly, and look, certain people can benefit from it, I'm sure. But when it comes to FAB, I really like the ability for everybody to have a fair shot at these players. In terms of how aggressive to be, the earlier in the season and the longer the role that the player will inherit, obviously the more aggressive you want to be. Some high stakes leagues, you're going to see people bidding, 40, 50% of their total FAB budget on one guy. But that might be a payoff for them. That might be their guaranteed RB3 or their flex player from that point moving forward. So, FAB, again, it's difficult to predict. I think another thing about FAB is, as I mentioned before, depending upon the total pool of FAB, the higher the pool, usually the less aggressive you necessarily have to be. If it's $1,000, some people are like, well, it's $1,000. If I spend $1 or $5 or $10 on people, it's not really going to be the death of me. $100, $50. The more concentrated that FAB pool in the beginning is going to be, the more careful you have to be with your money, obviously. All these tips sound pretty no-brainer, but I get questions on it every single stinking week. Big thing I wanted to touch on is making trades. I could probably have a 30-minute segment alone on how to make a trade. What's the best way to go about it? One thing I learned from a former colleague of mine, Lenny Melnick, again going back to fantasy baseball, is the best way to always start a trade for me is to not send an email. It's to not send a text. I know it's kind of old school, picking up the phone and actually speaking with someone, but I actually like to talk to someone on the phone when I'm trying to work through a trade with them. I find that speaking with them directly tends to lead to a higher success rate of a trade actually occurring in the first place. You get to kind of hear the tone a little bit better in terms of what the other manager's looking for. And if you're Rico Suave when it comes to pointing things out, you might be able to kind of, ease your way into things a little bit better. You can't force trades, though. I think that's the other thing you need to know. When Bob gets questions, a multitude of them on Twitter, and when I get these questions as well, hey, my entire league is out there, and I really want to trade Robbie Anderson. Who should I target? Well, when you have a trade, it's going to take two parties to tango. The easiest thing to do is to go ahead and take a look, like I said, going back to those strengths and weaknesses of your roster. Where can you improve? If you know that you need a wide receiver and another team's strong at that point and you have running backs to spare, there might be a match there, but you cannot force a trade. If you do try to force a trade and it just creates a more unbalanced structure in the league, then you might get the finger pointing at collusion and it might just get ugly, and you don't want to do that. So look, takes two to tango. You need to know which parties to contact. I would strongly encourage you, face-to-face is really the best thing to do, but pick up the phone. I think I find a lot gets lost in translation with the age of social media now, with text messages and emails and in-game message systems on all these different websites and stuff like that. The easiest way to make a trade is just to go ahead and do that. As a couple different little tips I've picked up with trades, generally speaking, when you want to have a particular player and you know that I want player A and I want to trade away player B, if I'm trying to sell a trade to Bob as an example, and I want to highlight all the positives of the guys that I'm giving away. Well, man, I really hate to part with this particular player. I mean, he does really have a lot of upside, and he's been great for me in the past. I mean, just take a look at what he did week 3. I mean, he could really repeat that again. I don't know if I really want to give up that. That's a lot better to say than, oh, yeah, you can have Bob. You want to phrase things in a certain way where it really looks like you're getting the screws turned on giving up these particular players. As is, you also, when you want to point out players that you're inheriting, strong thing to do is just to say, look, I really want to get this particular running back. I mean, I know it comes with a certain amount of risk, but man, I really think that the upside's there and it's worth taking, but it really kills me to do this trade. When you just start to say these little things like this, again, in person or over the phone, knowing the mindset of the other player, and everybody always wants to win a trade. Some people, and you always want to say, well, how did I do on this trade? Did I win the trade? Everybody's going to give up something in a trade. In an ideal trade, you give up, you get. Your team might improve in a certain area, might go down in a certain area. If you just flat out fleece the other guy, it's rare, but it's going to happen here and there. But I get these questions all the time. Who won this trade? Who got the better end of this trade? Bottom line is if both parties feel like they've improved their team, and that's ultimately what you want to accomplish. 2 other quick points, and then I'll obviously take any questions that Bob might have gotten here real fast. Bye weeks. Always try to get players the week ahead in bye weeks. I think that Bob will definitely agree with this. Every single bye week that's coming up, you're going to see, oh, well, like next week, this guy's projections go way up, and my team is suffering because I have 10 guys out this week. Try to always take a look at that 1 week prior. If there's maybe a player, an extra defense you might have carrying around, get rid of that guy or get rid of that team or whatever the week prior to you actually needing them. If it's a certain spot where you think you can kind of have that end of bench rotation, the amount of fab money that you will save doing that, as opposed to then it being that week and then, oh, well, their projection this week's a 5, but next week's a 15. Going against all the other players, again, it's going to save you a lot in the short run. Kickers and defenses as a whole, just to go back to that topic, I don't generally put a lot of money in them during drafts. I stream them. If you don't know how to stream defenses, just take a look at our website. We have lots of good articles about that. And the last point that I will make is handcuffing. I like to handcuff. I might be in the minority about handcuffing. I know that kind of goes a little bit back to the draft itself, but if you're able to obtain the direct handcuff to a running back in your format, and obviously the deeper the league, the more viable the strategy this is going to be. I like having those guys on my team in advance. I would rather have the guaranteed backup, if you want to term it that way, to a particular player, and not having to worry about getting to a fab war where I may or may not win out or lose out on the guy. And look, it might only be on the top 5-10 people, when it comes to the running back spots, but I'd rather have those guys in advance. So if they go undrafted, if James Conner goes undrafted or something like that, in years past, we always used to take a look at Adrian Peterson's backups and pick up the Gerhardts of the world, but get those guys in advance. I'd recommend that as well. I'd rather have a guaranteed guy as opposed to a flyer wide receiver. So those are just some tips and tricks. Bob, do we pick up any questions along the way?
To follow up on what you were asking, Jim Day asked, when it comes to waivers, do you recommend using most of your money early to get the breakout guys, or make sure to hold some players for late? And got another similar question from Kieran Mann in terms of not eating up your budget. Do you look to have fab into the playoffs? I know that there are different approaches to this. What do you recommend?
Well, like going back to kind of what I said before, if you know that a particular player is going to be inheriting a role for a longer period of time, obviously the more you're going to want to bid on them. I do like to have some fab left for the end of the year. I don't like to completely exhaust it and blow it all in the first couple weeks if I can help it. Again, speaking from the commissioner standpoint, I would also recommend commissioners allowing managers in their league to bid $0 on Fab. I know, again, that sounds a bit crazy, but I like to have that ability as well. Generally speaking, again, earlier in the season, more guarantee the role is going to be, the more aggressive I'm going to be, especially at running back. You're going to really pay dividends for that. With these wide receivers, whether it gets to be, especially in a PPR format, a guy, look, he might be the new slot receiver for Team ABC. Picking up those roles, I will be aggressive on them. Still like to have a couple bucks left at the end, but if I take a look at $100 in my pool, I would say at least $60 to $70 is probably going to be gone for me no later than maybe week 6 or 7.
Okay.
I generally am more aggressive earlier in the season.
Right. Mike Dempsey, if you didn't see him talking trades yesterday, he is one of those people that will spend all his fab week 1 if he has to. And just a quick point before I get to the next question, Mendo Bruce saying he doesn't think Connor is Bell's replacement. Had Adam Kaplan on our Sirius show today. He was just at Steelers camp. I know a lot of people are on Jalen Samuels, who will have a role, but Kaplan still thinks Bell is the direct replacement for now. We'll see how that goes. One other question along the lines of what you've been talking about, and I think you addressed this, but let's get a little more specific. How long
Sure.
do you hold on to that underperforming guy? Does it depend on who it is?
A lot does depend upon who it is. Does it depend upon their track record? Does it is the player dealing with an injury? Is that one of the big things? A lot of days nowadays, you have these cryptic. Well, I really didn't want to tell my coach that I was dealing with a hamstring strain, and I couldn't really perform at 100%. Look, that's going to happen, but the more you spent in the draft to obtain a particular talent, the longer I'm willing to sit through and suffer with some, growing pains through the handful of weeks. And there's going to be other factors as well. Is there a new offensive system? Is there a new coordinator that they're dealing with? Is a different quarterback behind helm? Especially in this season where a lot of these, playoff-bound quote-unquote teams have new quarterbacks, they're going to have to get used to playing with these guys as well. So I'll be patient with a lot of these players. If it's a guy that you drafted just pure upside, Hail Mary type in the beginning, and it gets to be week 3 or 4 and he's done bump guess, cut him.
Yeah, my new mantra is September is the new August, right? And that makes October the new September. Some of this has to do with the workout rules. The CBA keeps the teams from having the same amount of contact, working the same amount over the offseason. And it takes a little longer for the offense to gel. And I think that also that factors in is coaches worried about getting their superstars hurt. We just don't see the big names playing. I'm fine with that as a fantasy owner, but I think that early, offensive turmoil is kind of a byproduct of that.
Yep.
All right. So we're going to wrap up. Evan, anyone got any last second question here before I run him off for the night? We've got Dr. Roto standing by to come on and talk a little bit about his draft strategy. So I want to say thanks to Evan. You can find him on